A young Apache woman stands in front of 300 people, holding a piece of paper above her head. She's reading it out loud in English, word by word. With every sentence, the crowd grows quieter. The army officers at the back of the gathering shift uncomfortably. One of them reaches for his sidearm. Because what this woman is reading out loud is a treaty the U.S. government presented to her people as a promise of peace. But the words in the paper don't say peace. They say surrender. They say relocation. They say the Apache give up all rights to their ancestral land, permanently, with no compensation. And nobody was supposed to know, because nobody in the tribe was supposed to be able to read it. Her name is Mika. She's 24 years old, and by the time she finishes reading that document, the United States Army will want her dead. To understand how a single woman with the ability to read became the most dangerous person on the Arizona frontier, you need to go back 15 years to a mission school where a 7-year-old Apache girl picked up a book for the first time. The mission at San Carlos was run by a Methodist preacher named Reverend Arthur Hollis. Unlike many frontier missionaries who saw their work as a project of cultural destruction, Hollis genuinely believed that literacy was a gift, not a weapon. He taught any child who would sit still long enough to learn. Apache children, Mexican children, the mixed heritage children of frontier settlements, anyone. Mika's mother brought her to the mission during a period of peace between the San Carlos Band and the local military garrison. She wanted her daughter to understand the language of the people who controlled their lives. Not to become white, to understand what white men said when they thought Apache people couldn't follow the conversation. Mika learned fast. By 9, she could read newspapers. By 11, she was reading legal documents the Reverend kept in his study, land deeds, court transcripts, military correspondence. She developed a vocabulary that most frontier settlers didn't possess. Then the mission closed. Reverend Hollis was reassigned east, and the Army decided that educating Apache children was counterproductive. An Apache who can read, wrote one officer in a report that still survives in territorial archives, is an Apache who can cause trouble. They had no idea how right they were. Mika returned to her band and grew into a young woman who moved between two worlds. She spoke Apache fluently. She spoke English fluently. She could read, write, and understand the legal language that governed treaties, land transfers, and military orders. In a world where information was power, Mika held more of it than any single person on either side of the frontier line. Now, here's the historical context that makes what happened next not just a story, but a reflection of something that happened over and over across the American West. The U.S. government presented hundreds of treaties to Native American nations during the 1800s. These treaties were written in complex legal English, filled with subclauses, conditional language, and terms that even educated white Americans would struggle to parse. The Army brought interpreters to treaty signings, but those interpreters were often soldiers or scouts with basic language skills, not legal translators. In many documented cases, the English text of a treaty said something significantly different from what the interpreter told the tribal leaders it contained. The Apache knew this. They'd been burned before. But without someone who could read the actual document, they had no way to prove it. In the spring of 1873, a delegation from the territorial government arrived at the San Carlos region to present a new agreement. The terms, as explained through the interpreter, were generous. The Apache would retain their traditional hunting grounds, receive annual supplies of cattle and grain, and be allowed to govern their own affairs within a designated territory. The chiefs were cautious but interested. A council was called. The entire band gathered to hear the terms discussed before the chiefs would make their marks on the paper. The Army interpreter stood up and read the document aloud, translating into Apache as he went. He described a partnership. He described mutual respect. He described boundaries that would protect Apache land from white settlement. Then Mika raised her hand. The interpreter stopped. The Army officers looked at her with mild irritation. A young woman interrupting a treaty proceeding was unusual. "May I see the document?" she asked in perfect English. The lead officer, a major named Dalton, frowned. "The interpreter is reading it for you." "I'd like to read it myself." A murmur passed through the Apache gathering. The Army officers exchanged glances. Major Dalton hesitated, but denying a request to see a public treaty document would look suspicious. He handed it over. Mika read the document in silence for about 3 minutes. The crowd waited. The officers waited. The interpreter wiped sweat from his forehead. Then Mika began reading out loud. Not the interpreter's version, the actual English text, translated accurately into Apache, sentence by sentence. Now, if you're the kind of person who stays with a story to hear the truth come out, subscribe. Because what Mika read to her people that day changed everything. The treaty did not promise the Apache their hunting grounds. It promised them a designated reservation of 60 square miles, roughly 1/10 of their traditional territory. The rest would be opened to settlement, which meant given to white ranchers and miners. The annual cattle and grain supply was conditional on continued peaceful behavior as determined by the territorial military authority, which meant the Army could cut off food at any time for any reason. And buried in a subclause on the 3rd page, the treaty included a sentence that nobody in the tribe had been told about. All Apache persons residing outside the designated reservation boundaries after the ratification date shall be considered hostile combatants subject to military action. In plain language, any Apache who continued living on their own ancestral land would be legally classified as an enemy combatant. The peace treaty was a declaration of war with a smile on it. Mika read every word. The translation was precise. When she finished, the silence in the clearing was absolute. Then the chiefs stood up. One by one, they walked away from the treaty table without making their marks. The document was unsigned. Major Dalton was furious. He'd been sent to get signatures, not to negotiate. The treaty had been carefully crafted to look generous in translation, while being devastating in its actual terms. And a 24-year-old woman had just dismantled the entire strategy in 15 minutes. Within a week, a report was filed at Fort Grant, describing Mika as an agitator of hostile intent, who incites Apache resistance against lawful government authority. The report recommended she be detained or neutralized. A bounty was posted. $200, dead or alive. The bounty hunters came fast. On the frontier, $200 was more than most men earned in 6 months. Within days, armed men were asking questions at trading posts, following Apache trails, watching the edges of the San Carlos territory. Mika's band moved her deeper into the mountains. But the chief understood something that terrified him. The Army wouldn't stop. As long as Mika was alive and could read, no fraudulent treaty would ever succeed with her people again. She wasn't just a person. She was a capability they needed to destroy. A cowboy named Fletcher Dunn heard the full story at a trading post near Globe. Fletcher had been at the treaty gathering. He'd stood at the back of the crowd, trading mule hides, when Mika had stood up and started reading. He'd watched the officers' faces change. He'd seen the exact moment Major Dalton realized the deception had been exposed. And Fletcher knew the truth. The woman was reading the document accurately. He'd seen enough land contracts in his own dealings to recognize what a conditional clause looked like. The treaty was exactly the fraud Mika said it was. When Fletcher heard about the bounty, something turned in his gut. Not chivalry. Anger. The army was trying to kill a woman for reading out loud. He rode into the mountains to find her. It took him a week. The Apache didn't trust him. 3 times he was stopped by warriors who told him to turn back. Each time he said the same thing. I was at the treaty signing. I heard what she read. She told the truth, and I'll swear it in any court. Finally, they brought him to Mika. She was camped in a narrow box canyon in the Pinals, with 4 warriors guarding the approaches. She was sitting by a small fire, reading a Bible. The Reverend Hollis had given it to her when the mission closed. It was the only English book she owned. "You're the cowboy from the trading post," she said. "Fletcher Dunn." "Why are you here?" "Because you read that treaty exactly right. I know it, and the army knows it. That's why they want you dead. And that's wrong." Mika studied him. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Fletcher sat down across the fire. "I plan to make sure you stay alive long enough to read the next one they bring. And the one after that." What followed was 5 months of running. Fletcher and Mika moved through the mountains of central Arizona Territory, staying ahead of bounty hunters and army patrols. Fletcher knew the cowboy trails. Mika knew the Apache paths. Between them, they had a map of the territory that nobody else possessed. Along the way, Mika did something the army never anticipated. She began teaching other Apache to read. In every camp they passed through, she spent evenings by the fire with young men and women, scratching English letters in the dirt, sounding out words, explaining the structure of legal language. "If they kill me," she told Fletcher one night, "the knowledge dies with me. But if I teach 50 people to read, they can never silence us again." By the time the army found them, Mika had taught basic English reading to over 30 Apache men and women across 7 different bands. The bounty hunters caught up at a canyon crossing near the Salt River. 6 men on horseback, armed with rifles. Fletcher stood between them and Mika. He had 1 pistol and a skinning knife. "Step aside, cowboy," the lead bounty hunter said. "She's worth $200. "She's worth more than that," Fletcher replied. "She's worth every lie the government ever tried to pass off as a treaty." The standoff held for a long, terrible minute. Then something happened that the bounty hunters didn't expect. From the canyon walls above them, Apache warriors appeared. Dozens of them, from multiple bands, men and women Mika had taught to read. They'd followed the bounty hunters through the mountains and positioned themselves on the high ground. They were armed, but they didn't fire. Instead, one of them, a young warrior Mika had taught just weeks earlier, held up a piece of paper and shouted down in English, "We can read now, all of us. You cannot kill what we have learned." The bounty hunters looked up at the canyon walls. They looked at each other. Then they turned their horses around and rode south. The bounty was eventually withdrawn, not because the army had a change of heart, but because it became clear that killing Mika would accomplish nothing. The skill she carried had been planted in too many minds. The army couldn't put a bounty on literacy itself. There's a truth buried in this story that applies far beyond the Arizona frontier. The most dangerous weapon isn't a rifle or a sword. It's the ability to read the document before you sign it. Every unjust system in history has relied on the same strategy. Keep the people you're exploiting from understanding the terms of their exploitation. Mika didn't fire a single shot. She read a piece of paper out loud. And that was enough to stop a theft that would have taken everything her people had. Mika continued teaching for the rest of her life. She never held a weapon. She never led a war party. But the army considered her more dangerous than any warrior who ever held a rifle. Because warriors can be defeated. Knowledge, once shared, cannot be unlearned. Sometimes the bravest act on the frontier wasn't drawing a gun. It was opening a book. If this story resonated with you, the real history of fraudulent treaties on the American frontier and the people who fought back is on screen now.